Here's an interesting point about holding the arrows in the bow hand. If you look at historical paintings of archers who hold arrows in the bow hand, you will notice that with a few exceptions here and there, the vast majority of archers have the arrows oriented with the points going up, that is, pointing towards the top of the bow. You see this both when they are holding the bow and when they are actually shooting it. This technique is not just limited to paintings. You also see it in historical photographs as well as in use by present-day tribes that still use archery. You can, of course, find counterexamples here and there, but they are definitely in the minority. And that got me thinking, is there a practical reason for this? Does the orientation really matter? And if it matters, how much does it really matter? The first set of points deals with the shooting aspect. With the points pointing up, the most obvious technique for nocking the arrow is to grasp it either right below the arrowhead or at least on the forward third of the arrow. It's right in front of you and the easiest part to reach. The advantage to this is that you have the maximum leverage and control over a sharp broadhead. Depending on where you live and hunt, that broadhead might have poison on it. And you don't grab a snake by the tail, do you? You grab it right behind its head. One way to proceed from here is to load the arrow in between the string and the bow, but this runs the risk of accidentally nicking the string with the broadhead. I mean, just look at how careful I'm being here. So instead, I like to go just outside the string. Although this involves a wider, more circular movement than the first method, this is a movement that you can do fairly quickly and smoothly, with the confidence that you aren't going to hurt yourself, nick the bowstring, or scratch the bow. On the other hand, compare this with variations of a common technique for nocking an arrow with the points pointed downwards. It involves grabbing the arrow closer to the nock and loading in between the string and the bow. When you do this, you don't have as precise control over that point. Even if you get a secure grip, if you're not careful, you might accidentally hurt yourself, the string, or the bow. Again, just look at how apprehensive I am during the whole process. Trust me, broadheads do not feel good. Just ask the animal. However, a very good counter-argument to this is that you don't necessarily have to nock an arrow this way. I've seen footage of warriors in Papua New Guinea load using a rather different method that pivots the arrow to the inside of the riser, more or less completely avoiding the safety issue. At least as far as shooting is concerned. My second set of points deals with the carrying and walking aspects of holding arrows in the bow hand. With the points pointing up, you've got good awareness over where they are. They are at the very least in your peripheral vision. And the natural back and forth motion of the arms while walking doesn't make the business end pass across the leg, no matter how close to your hands you bring the points. People who train with firearms often refer to something called the workspace. That is the area right in front of you where you have maximum visual acuity and dexterity. The point of an arrow carried on your side and slightly forward might not be immediately in your workspace by combat pistol standards, but the same general concept applies. It also applies to the earlier examples involving the shooting aspect. Anytime I have something or someone dangerous in my vicinity, I'd rather have it in front of me where I can see it and control it at all times. Another advantage with the points up is that if you use very long arrows, such as in the Amazon or Papua New Guinea, you can easily stand and rest with the bows going vertically. That way, the points don't get dulled from being jabbed into the ground, and they are largely out of the way of their surroundings. You can also sit down without having to put anything on the ground, and again, the points are up and out of harm's way. On the other hand, if the points are behind and below you, the points can potentially pass across your leg during motion. The human arm naturally has a bit more movement forward than it does backward. Because of this, you run the risk of stabbing or slicing yourself in the leg. Now, one might argue that you could easily just hold the arrows close to the nock with the points further back, but then the point protrudes backwards and you might stab someone else in the leg, or perhaps somewhere a bit more personal. Also, if your broadheads are barbed in any way, they could get snagged on brush, which isn't necessarily dangerous, but it is rather inconvenient. Now, I can imagine someone arguing that the points running up and forwards could also easily stab someone in front of you, but this is easily and safely solved by just choking up on the arrows a bit. And in fact, that technique appears to be the status quo. Again, the concept of the workspace applies. With the arrows in front of you, you can see them and control them. In fairness, you don't necessarily have to carry the bow in the ways I have shown thus far, but it's not exactly at the ready when carried using alternative methods. People living in circumstances where they rely on bows and arrows for survival might be incredibly skilled with all aspects of their use, but they usually aren't reckless. They will avoid unnecessary risk if there is a safe and effective alternative. I think that is probably the reason why carrying arrows in the bow hand, with points oriented up or forwards, seems to predominate in all the available examples. Maybe present day cultures that do this don't have a formal tradition of instruction with a clearly articulated vision as to the correct method. After all, many traditions survive just because they are traditions. In this case, neither option is really wrong, but one might simply be more right than the other.